right, hello everybody, and welcome to the first lecture of the course. Hopefully this lecture will give you a pretty representative example of what to expect out of these lectures and how to move from these lectures and the reading, into the discussion section. So today we're going to be adding some concepts to your reading and adding a few adding some historical information, as well. But we're also going to be reviewing what was in your reading to a certain extent. We're going to use it as illustrations or examples of larger concepts that you can Google, of course, but in terms of in the course are going to primarily be discussed through lecture and discussed amongst ourselves in the discussion section. Okay. So enough said about that. Let's begin. Today we're going to be looking at this concept of war capitalism. Now, what do I mean by war capitalism? Well, simply put, war capitalism is one way of understanding the early development of the global market of this Atlantic world that your textbook discussed. And it argues that when capitalism first developed, coercion, violence, and slavery were essential to creating the markets and the industries that fueled economic development, particularly in Europe. But as we've seen, right, that economic development depended on a global network of economic exchange. Now, according to the idea of war capitalism, it's only after these industries were well underway via the methods of coercion, violence, and slavery, only after that, mostly in the 19th century, did war capitalism give way to industrial capitalism, which is closer to what we think of when we just sort of conjure up the idea of capitalism. And this is a situation, industrial capitalism, where slavery rather than low-wage labor was the exception, right? Where slavery is either not present or only present in sort of faraway regions out of sight, rather than being the rule. But in war capitalism, right, we see slavery being very common, right, almost being, right, the rule rather than the exception, and it being fundamental to building, right, the structure of this early global economy. And even though war capitalism eventually gives way to industrial capitalism, the argument behind using this phrase, war capitalism, reminds us that both war capitalism and industrial capitalism were capitalism, but they were different stages in the development of this economic system. Now, I want to take a moment to note that this is one recent idea about how to think historically about capitalism. Not all historians would prescribe to this particular scheme or use this particular phrase. It is, however, uncontested, right, that the early development of the Atlantic world of global markets did involve a lot of violence. For example, as we saw from our textbook reading this week, the Portuguese would sometimes develop consensual trade relationships with the African cities and kingdoms that they began coming in contact with, right, in the 16th century. But when that proved unsatisfying, they would turn to destroying entire trading ports and murdering anybody who stood against them. Many places were razed to the ground and to this day are nothing but a pile of ruins. So this extension of the early global market was very, very far from peaceful, far from consensual. Another example, this is not from your textbook reading, so don't worry about it, but do take notes on it as I go along here, is the development of the cotton industry and the rise of Britain. So before we're talking about trade networks constructed by the Portuguese, Britain is also engaging in almost the exact same patterns elsewhere in the world. Cotton became an incredibly important commodity across the world. It's a very desirable product to make a very desirable fabric. Cotton is sturdy yet warm, softer than wool, right? There's all sorts of qualities about cotton which made it very desirable. And it was Britain that developed technology to create a lot of clothing out of this desirable fabric. However, cotton does not grow well in European climates. And so multiple European countries, but especially Britain, used war and slavery to establish cotton plantations in other regions of the world where it did grow well. And in turn, that forced labor, enslaved, cotton plantation labor, fueled the rise of industrialization in Britain. The textile industry, which is basically the production of cloth, is on the forefront of the development of capitalism in Britain. Now, these historical examples of the connection between war, violence, slavery, and the development of capitalism clashes with the classical economic theory of capitalism, what it is, and how it works. And this actually dates back several hundred years. As soon as you have capitalism looking somewhat familiar, getting close to hegemonic, meaning sort of in control of the global system, you get theories about what it's actually about and how it actually functions. The most famous of these was a series of books and treatises written by Adam Smith, but the most famous one was actually published in 1776, not coincidentally, in terms of sort of the larger significance, the same year as the Declaration of Independence was written in the United States, and it was called The Wealth of Nations. And what Adam Smith basically laid out as, he didn't use the word capitalism, but this is what he was talking about. And he says it's not about control, right? The economy should not be about nation states trying to control economic activity or prevent, other nations or other interested parties from engaging in trade. How it should work is everyone should make consensual decisions about what is in their own self-interest, and the invisible hand, is the expression that he did originate, will magically sort out everything to the best possible outcome, which will also be harmonious. So here is this idea, that if you have a hands-off approach to the economy and everyone just freely trades with everyone else and there are no strictures placed on that process, that you'll actually get a situation that's best for everybody. And he argued that this typified this growing global market, and it should continue to typify it. In places where there are too many restraints placed on the market, they should be removed. The importance here, though, is that this paints a picture, of a consensual process where coercion or force is not a significant dynamic creating this economic system. Now, contemporary economists today, most of them don't believe in this idea of what capitalism is and how it works anymore. Some still do. Some still hold very strongly to this classical formula. For example, the Chicago School, a group of economists coming out of the University of Chicago, generated a sort of renaissance of this way of thinking in the second half of the 20th century. But for the most part, most economists like things about capitalism, but they don't think that if you just let laissez-faire, just let everybody do whatever they want to, that the best possible outcome will result for everybody. For example of this, if you're curious, a recent book published in the last few years by a man named Pickney called Capital in the 21st Century argues that actually such a situation results in consolidation of wealth and the growth of inequality, which, according to most people, is not the ideal result. Nonetheless, despite the fact that this sort of classical understanding of capitalism has limited, if not non-existent, academic credit, most people today continue to think of capitalism as it is defined abstractly, meaning capitalism is a non-coercive system. Capitalism is about free labor, free property, these sort of concepts. Not free property as in you don't have to pay for it, but private property that cannot be forcibly violated. So in sort of the larger populace, in popular political culture, in our imaginations, right? Kind of what we automatically think of, if not necessarily what we think of when we stop and really go through it critically. But by default, right, this is still kind of the popular idea of what capitalism is and what capitalism is about. And if the reality doesn't really match up to that, then reality is not really capitalist, and we're not really talking about capitalism. For example, this would be the position of a hardline libertarian who would probably say to any critique of capitalism that, all of these examples you're giving are actually problems because the state was interfering. There wasn't true laissez-faire capitalism. So that's the abstract classical economic understanding of what we should think of when we think of capitalism. Now, the problem with this is that it clashes with the historical record. Such a position has to remain entirely theoretical or abstract because the historical record of the growth and development and contemporary existence of capitalism offers too many counter examples, right? Too many things that don't fit into this ideal picture of what capitalism is. For example, you can think about the early United States, which brings us back around to the development of slavery that was discussed in your reading. So the United States wasn't discussed much in today's reading. It's only mentioned very briefly in the margins, but the slave-based southern states of the colonial British colonies and then the later United States were entirely dependent, right, up until the Civil War on the system of slavery. Now, when we talk about the early United States, the southern slaveholding states of the U.S. are often compared or contrasted to the North. The South is depicted as backward and undeveloped, which was certainly true. It was much less developed, less roads, less railroads, all those sort of things. But in compared to the industrialized North, where you had lots of roads and you had factory development and railways and canals and all this such, when the South is compared to this industrialized North, where there was no slavery and free labor was the economic means of providing labor, the South is often regulated to being pre-modern or pre-capitalist, right? This is something other than capitalist because, as we all know, it can't be capitalist unless there's free labor involved and there's no course of slavery, right? That would be the classical economic theory response. However, this contrast is really drawn too sharply and forgets that these two systems did not exist independently of one another. The capitalist development that we see in the North, this industrial capitalism, was fueled by cotton production from the South, which was in turn fueled by slavery. And it was indeed the textile industry in the North that was one of the very first, probably the first industry to really take off in the North and lead to and encourage this kind of economic development that we later can comfortably call or confidently call industrial capitalism. So again, here there's a problem of abstractly separating a system of free labor and capitalism from a system of slavery and saying that's not capitalism, when historically, if you want to say on the ground or in reality, these things are very intertwined and in fact codependent on one another for their development. So this brings us to the historical problem segment for today's lecture, and this is what we're going to be discussing in our discussion contributions this week. And the historical problem we're dealing with here is how we should understand the early development of capitalism. Should we understand it through the strictly defined ideas articulated by experts and theorists of economics? Or should we understand the manifestation of these developments that we see in the historical record? Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that whatever your reply to this question is, they are always interrelated. Historical circumstances and developments influence ideas, and ideas in turn inform the decisions and the actions that human beings take. No one really disputes that they're both interrelated and informing each other. No historian, that is, currently working today that anyone's listening to. But nonetheless, we are left with a kind of chicken and egg question as to which one comes first, or which one's more fundamental, or which one is the real engine, the real essential ingredient to these historical developments and processes that we're observing. So, roughly speaking, there are 3 different ways of answering this question. First, you can take what is known as the historical materialist position. And this position stipulates that historical circumstances, developments, and basic human needs come first. Meaning, what's around you on the ground? Are you in the middle of a desert, on top of a mountain? Are you in a field with limited technology? Or are you in a mountainous region with lots of technology, right? What is the historical circumstance? That comes first. Then ideas develop out of them. Now, this perspective is known as historical materialism, but it's not to be confused with scientific materialism. The idea, right, that nothing in the world, in the universe, exists but matter. This is usually associated with an atheistic or skeptical worldview, right? It might be related in certain respects to materialism, but it's not the exact same thing. So I just wanted to make that caveat clear. But usually, historical materialism refers to or holds as most important economic motives, right? So the materialism part there is usually referring to the economic dynamic or the economic aspect of any historical time and place. But as economic, I don't mean that we should be thinking narrowly as economics only referring to money or greed, but to basic human needs that ultimately are rooted in biology, right? So it's a kind of a capacious understanding of economic dynamics. You could think of it as material interests, right? And material doesn't necessarily mean money. It could be the need for clothes, right? Or the need for food. As a historical materialist might argue, even though the relationship between ideas and material circumstance is, of course, complex, at the end of the day, our imaginary, right, materialist might say, you've got to eat. And therefore, this reality is the prime mover of historical developments, because it doesn't matter like what ideas you come up with, you're going to starve if you don't get a hold of material necessities. All right. Now, the second sort of a way of approaching this is referred to as idealism. And idealism says, look, action, human action in the world onto the physical world is impossible without ideas, right? Man picks up a rock. He has to think of the idea of shaping that into a tool to acquire food before he can do so. So they prioritize the importance of ideas, and they say clusters of ideas, which is basically what most scholars refer to or mean when they refer to culture. Culture is a cluster of interrelated ideas, right, that's used to understand your world. They say culture comes first. As one idealist, historical idealist, recently put it, quote, I prefer a culturalist view that holds that culture is more important, giving literature, art, music, theater, film, religion, and associations a greater role in social change than economic incentives. That's me inserting that into the quote. But this idealist ends with the point, what are structures but solidified ideas? There is a third option, however, between what we can kind of describe as these two opposite poles. There's a position where you could say, look, it's neither or either or. This is the person or the historian who says this is a distracting, stupid question, this chicken and egg question, that sets up a deterministic formula either way you answer it. Deterministic meaning dogmatic, right? It's going to ignore other evidence to the contrary because it already has the answer. This person might say the real world is a lot messier than this. It's not ultimately all about materialism, or ultimately idealism is always stronger. They would say the relationship between lived reality and ideas can come in a variety of forms, dependent on the time and place. So it's a position that sort of refuses to make a choice, or refuses to even lean in one direction or the other. It steadfastly says, like, I'm not going to take a side here on this question of materialism versus idealism. Now, these three replies do not exhaust all possibilities, right? I've given you sort of a stereotypical materialist response, stereotypical idealism response, and a stereotypical I refuse to engage in the debate response. So in your discussion question this week, I want you to take a crack at what your reply to this conundrum, to this historical problem, might be. But make sure to include examples from either the reading or this lecture that account for why you are taking the position you are. There's no need, I want to stress, for certainty here, right? I'm not expecting you to craft a masterful explanation of everything in these discussions. Most historians themselves are constantly negotiating between themselves and rethinking themselves about where they fall on these questions. So just take a guess, right? You sitting here at your desk or in the coffee shop or driving home, wherever you're listening to this lecture, take a guess about what you think the appropriate or the most accurate, right, response might be about this question of materialism versus idealism. And worry less about being wrong when you're composing your answer for the discussion, and worry more about explaining why you've decided on this particular response for the moment. And when you're explaining why, again, make sure to draw from either the reading, the lecture, or ideally both. I also want to take a moment to, yes, reemphasize that there is no wrong answer here, right? It's not about what you say, it's about how you say it, i.e. if you back it up with evidence and explanations for why you find this the most compelling answer. But also, I want to address a popular prejudice, that the position in between is always the most accurate position, right? We have a kind of popular political idea, cultural idea that, someone all the way to this side of the question versus someone all the way to the other side of the question, both of them are probably wrong, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. Free yourself from that thinking, right? In other words, neither, this third option of I'm not going to engage in debate, can be a perfectly acceptable answer, but it's not the right, quote unquote, the right answer, right? Again, historians are currently hotly debating these questions, and there are many, many respected historians that lean very strongly in one direction or the other, right? Neither is not by any stretch of the imagination the obvious answer. Again, you don't have to come fully down on one side or the other, but you can say like, I think it's 60% materialism, 40% idealism, right? Or however, whatever metaphor or language you want to use to express what you think the correct sort of combination is. Okay. Just wanted to make sure I dispelled any suspicions that I'm fishing for a correct answer, and of course the correct answer is, neither or somewhere in between. I'm not fishing for that response. It's a fine response if that's really what you think, but I'm not fishing for it. Okay, so that finishes it up for this week, and you can move from the lecture into composing your discussion questions, which again, just as a reminder, will be due at 11:30 p.m. on Friday.